This program contains graphic animation from the video game Brothers in Arms, hailed by critics for its historically accurate depiction of World War II combat.
It was well after midnight, June 6, 1944, when nearly 18,000 Allied paratroopers dropped from the skies over Normandy.
All I saw was tracers. I felt that every gun in Normandy was shooting at me.
You had to get out of the plane. You don't stay in the plane on a combat jump. It's just that simple.
Behind them, the largest armada ever assembled was barreling toward the French coast. Before them, the vaunted German war machine.
Absolutely, I was scared. The bullets are flying around you.
You become a veteran right quick.
I can tell you right now, I always assumed I would be killed.
It was the duty of airborne divisions like the 101st to spearhead the Allied invasion of Europe.
That night, everything went into automatic. Training is learn to survive, and that's what you do, any way you can.
Over the next hour, you'll visit the historical locations, hear eyewitness accounts, and experience America's original paratroopers brought to life through state-of-the-art graphic animation. These brave men were the tip of the bayonet that drove the German army back to Berlin.
In this show, we'll place you at the tip of that bayonet with the 101st most decorated regiment of the Normandy invasion. They were called the 50 Deuce, and this is their story.
Took off from Embark, England. Everybody's nervous and excited.
We hadn't been in combat before and didn't realize really what we were getting into.
I wondered if I was really going to be able to just shoot a person, you know.
I always thought I'd be killed. I can tell you that right now. I always assumed I would be killed.
We had no idea how it was going to be, and we didn't care. We felt we were so well trained that, hey, we're the best.
The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was created in 1942. At the time, the use of airborne forces was still a novel concept.
The Germans pioneered the actual use of paratroops in combat in 1940 and 41.
And when they landed behind enemy lines, they caused great panic amongst the Allied forces.
The 101st Airborne Division was the American answer to the German paratrooper, and the 502nd, distinguished by a heart on its helmet, was the division's original regiment.
There was a tremendous appeal to being a paratrooper, and being a 502 was even a bigger appeal.
It was a challenge, you see. It was something that had never been done before, and so you wanted to get into it and be a part of it.
Of course, the pay entered into it because it was $50 a month. $50 a month was quite a lot of money.
The training was actually different from the rest of the Army because the training was more rugged. We were up at 5:30 in the morning, and they would take you out and tell you, now pour the water out of your canteen. You can't have any water to drink. This is going to be a forced march.
I thought I was a tough guy, but they break you down physically in parachute school.
The training had to be tough, because these were the men who would lead the invasion into France from behind German lines.
The Germans had met defeat in 1943 on the Russian front, but still all of Europe was pretty much under German control. The Allies knew that they had to launch an invasion of France if they were ever to get at Germany.
As the men of the 502nd made their way across the English Channel, some were able to look down and catch a glimpse of the armada below.
All down below, unbelievable. Nobody will ever see that again.
Some 6,000 ships, all headed for the coast of France.
To say you were nervous would be to understate it considerably.
Most of the men were quiet. They'd crack a joke every now and then.
Some guys slept, the smokers smoked. By the time we were told to stand up and hook up, then it became serious.
By the last week of May 1944, Allied paratroopers were sequestered in airfields across southern England. Security was tight as they prepared for the invasion.
We knew it was coming. We didn't have a sense of how soon it was going to be. We knew what we were there for.
We knew every house, every apple orchard, every road, every tree.
The paratroopers learned every detail of the operation.
And if you don't take care of your part of it, it could fall apart.
The 502nd was composed of roughly 2,200 men, with around 450 soldiers making up each of its 3 main battalions. The overall Allied invasion plan called for the paratroopers to drop into German-occupied Normandy on the Cotentin Peninsula of northern France. Each battalion was given key objectives as part of the invasion plan. The most critical objective was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis and his 2nd Battalion.
They had to destroy the German artillery battery at St. Martin de Varville. If the invasion was going to succeed, those guns had to be knocked out.
The 3rd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, was to back up Chapuis at the artillery battery and then move a half-mile northeast to secure 2 exit causeways coming off of Utah Beach.
They not only had to facilitate the seaborne troops coming inland with their vehicles, but they also had to prevent the other end of the causeway from being taken over by German troops.
Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy and the 1st Battalion were to seize a complex of barracks that housed German troops who manned the artillery battery.
The soldiers were all stationed in a series of houses that became known as the XYZ complex. And those soldiers had to be killed or captured.
Cassidy also had a 2nd objective, just over a mile from the XYZ barracks. He had to secure Foucaultville, a small town on the northern flank of the invasion beach.
The Allied planners knew that if the 4th Infantry Division was to land at Utah Beach and be immediately counterattacked by German tanks or German infantry, that the whole exercise could be a disaster and the invasion might fail.
The paratroopers were set to jump the night of June 4th, but bad weather forced General Eisenhower to postpone the invasion. On June 5th, however, weather reports revealed a narrow window of opportunity to make the attack. That day, as the paratroopers were about to board their planes, Eisenhower paid them a visit.
It was impressive that our top commander came down to see us off, to boost your morale.
I'm in the marshalling area, and there's Ike standing in front of me. And he said, "How do you feel?" Well, we felt like we could lick the world, and that's exactly what we told him. We're ready. We're gonna give them hell.
General Eisenhower's air marshal told him that the airborne forces would take 80% casualties. General Eisenhower was making a decision that would involve thousands of lives and possibly the future of the Allied cause.
Just before midnight, all of the planes carrying the 101st Airborne Division were in the air. Nearly 500 C-47 aircraft, 6,670 soldiers, a 1-hour flight to meet their fate. They approached the Cotentin Peninsula from the west. But just as they reached the coastline, all of their carefully laid plans vanished into the first fog bank.
It was very hard to fly in tight formation because they rely on visual contact from each airplane.
Within minutes of hitting the coast of Normandy, anti-aircraft fire began exploding all around them.
It was scary. The plane was bucking, and the pilots started taking evasive action and got out of formation.
Some of the pilots changed course. Almost all of them increased their speed.
That was the first time those pilots had flown in combat.
I was wondering if the plane was going to crash.
You see fireworks coming up.
A piece of flak hit the plane right where I was standing, went between my legs.
and all I do is kept hollering and using a few choice words to get out of the plane, get out of the plane.
The planes flying out of Membry carrying Cassidy's battalion managed to stay on course, but the lead planes carrying the men of Chapuis and Cole out of Greenham Common came under intense fire and took evasive action. As they prepared to make their jump, the men of the 5-0 Deuce had no idea how far off course they were.
You had to get out of the plane. You don't stay in the plane on a combat jump. It's just that simple.
All I saw was tracers. I didn't see a single person in the air, and I felt that every gun in Normandy was shooting at me.
Thousands upon thousands of paratroopers descended on the Normandy countryside that night, German fire lighting up the skies all around them. Scattered and off course as they hit the ground, the 101st would be in for a long, hard night.
Of the thousands of American paratroopers who descended upon the Normandy countryside, less than 1/3 actually parachuted onto their designated drop zone. In fields like this one, the far-flung members of the 502nd first struggled to figure out just how far off course they really were.
When we hit France, it was like Broadway, all lit up.
And the planes are rocking back and forth.
When I went out, I couldn't have been over 700-800 feet because it's wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, hitting the ground.
The low altitude and high velocity of the jump often had harmful consequences on the ground. The 502nd's regimental commander, Colonel George Mosley, broke his leg, a common injury that night. Others, however, suffered a far worse fate.
Here I was 19 years old and I saw this plane come over. The pilot evidently gave the signal to jump, and he was going way too fast and he was way too low, and I could see the shadowy figures coming out. The chutes were pulling out of the pack train or hitting the ground. They were all killed.
Of the 6,670 paratroopers of the 101st who dropped that night, roughly 1,500 were either killed or captured. The Air Corps lost 38 planes to German flak.
It was a disaster as far as I'm concerned. It was a highly, highly disorganized jump.
I don't know of anyone that landed exactly where they were supposed to.
I had no idea where the hell I was when I first landed. I started wandering around, and the first man I came across was Colonel Cassidy. His words to me, "Belfry, where are we?" And I said, "Colonel, how in the hell do I know? I just got here."
Lieutenant Colonel Cassidy was actually better off than his fellow commanders. He landed near the regiment's designated drop zone, which was close to Saint-Martin-de-Varville. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis was well off his target, but more significantly, he was all alone. His 2nd Battalion had landed miles south of him. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, however, had it the worst.
Colonel Cole landed very close to St. Mary-Glise on his jump. And he hung up in a huge rose bush, and he couldn't get out of it for 15 minutes, and the needles were stinging his face and his hands. He was very unhappy. Cole knocked on a door with a guy who spoke French.
And this poor lady who was inside there, who must have been in her 70s or 80s, was scared to death. And that's the first time where he realizes he has a long walk to get up with the rest of his men.
In total, the men of the 502nd were spread out over a 10-mile radius.
The guys who were dropped on the wrong map, they either got killed, captured, or went through hell trying to get back.
My orders were, as soon as the drop was over, was to migrate toward the objective. But I didn't see any of our people.
Finding another person or finding other people was a job.
Allied ships would hit the beach in less than 6 hours. The paratroopers had to regroup and reach their assigned objectives by then, or the invasion would be doomed.
Absolutely, I was scared. And anybody that said they wasn't was a liar. I don't care who they are.
I took a drink of water, and it was like pouring water on a hot stove. My throat was so dry. I was just so frightened.
When you're really scared, your imagination gets the best of you. Every sound is magnified, and even the sight of what is in front of you changes.
That's what all that training was for with the head, I guess, to make us understand that it's war and that's it.
That night, everything went into automatic. Training is learn to kill, learn to survive, and that's what you do in any way you can.
First thing I did is I crawled over to a hedgerow where I was in the shadows and wondered if I was all by myself in Normandy, because I didn't see a single person, no sound of any kind.
When guys came to the ground, it was pitch dark. So the first thing is finding your friends.
For paratroopers stumbling out in the dark, they relied on code words, flash and thunder, to identify friendly faces. They also relied on crickets.
The cricket was just a simple child's toy that had been created for this mission.
When you got on the ground and you saw somebody you didn't know who it was, you mashed the cricket. Now, if he didn't mash the cricket, then you shot him. And everybody that had a cricket was mashing it. You could hear crickets everywhere.
I was trying to find someone, and I ran into the figure on the ground. It was about 30 feet away, and I clicked it, and there was no response. And I thought, well, I've got to kill this man. And I was sweating. Sweat was running out under my armpits and off my elbows. And you can feel your heart beating and feel the pulse in your temples, because no matter how much training you got, suddenly you've got to kill a guy.
For the paratroopers of the 502nd, that night was their first taste of actual combat, their first encounter with violent death up close.
A lot of the paratroopers saw some very horrible things, and much of it was what the Germans did to their buddies when they had the misfortune to land in the wrong place.
I remember seeing one guy, the Germans had, I don't know how to say this. They castrated him. I guess that's the only way to say it. Yeah, it's one of the worst things I ever saw.
It bothered me, even today it does, thinking about it.
It just made you more determined, you see, to win the battle.
Despite the confusion in the hours after the jump, the paratroopers began to reassemble into makeshift groupings.
We were all mixed up. 501 guys, 506 guys, 502 guys, some 82nd guys. We made our own little army, you might say.
Who they were, or what outfit they were, and it really didn't matter. But it didn't take us long to run into a bunch of Germans, and the fun started.
Every regiment had objectives. We were trained to go accomplish a mission. That's a hell of a lot harder to do than it is to say, because you might have 3 fights before you get there.
Stories of combat from that first night paint a very chaotic picture. Germans and Americans constantly surprising one another, firing a few shots, and then running away.
It was just a question of doing as much damage as you could.
The soldiers of the 101st, the soldiers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment didn't need someone to tell them what to do. They did it on their own. And if they were the only guy, they were going to accomplish the mission.
All over Normandy, actions like these were taking place. The heroics and initiative displayed by the airborne forces quite literally saved the invasion at a time when success was very much in doubt. But as morning approached and the 502nd struggled to put itself back together, the amphibious forces were beginning to land. The longest day was just beginning. After the drop, members of the 502nd were scrambling to find their units, and by dawn they were as ready as they'd ever be. The first light was just climbing over the horizon when the 502nd brought the fight to the enemy.
We had trained in England, we had rehearsed for D-Day, so everybody knew their duties.
The one objective that the Allied High Command considered paramount to protecting the landing at Utah Beach was the artillery battery at San Martin de Varville.
That was our primary objective, to knock that out, because it would cause a lot of problems for the troops coming in on Utah Beach.
The amphibious invasion at Utah Beach was expected to unload 1,700 vehicles and over 23,000 men from the 4th Infantry Division. Leading the primary mission to protect them from the battery was a man they called Silent Steve, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis.
Silent Steve didn't talk very much.
I think everybody liked him, and I know I did, and I trusted in his leadership.
For days leading up to the invasion, Allied naval and air forces had pounded German defensive positions.
There was a tremendous effort to make sure that the German defenses were weakened prior to the invasion.
They were just bombing all over the place.
The Allied planners knew exactly where the artillery battery was located and where the guns were positioned.
Despite the advanced bombardment, the 502nd was still expecting a fierce ground battle for control of the battery.
The funny thing is, you know how many times we actually practiced in England to take a gun emplacement? Once. And I thought, my God, I'm going to die certainly taking this gun emplacement.
But Chapuis and his men were shocked by what they encountered when they arrived at the site of their objective.
The battery had been knocked out.
This was already blown clean out of the ground.
Objective number 1 was secure. Chapuis' 2nd Battalion now occupied the guns of San Martin de Varville. Still standing today, hidden beneath decades of growth, are the remains of that very battery. Many local residents are still here as well, such as René Delejeune, who grew up in the shadows of those German guns.
And these guns could concentrate fire onto Utah Beach.
Utah Beach,
or so was the fear.
My parents' farmhouse was about 1/3 of a mile from here, and throughout the occupation, there were Germans there. There were about 10 acres of pasture over there, and 23 bombs hit it. It was very intense.
Were you afraid? Were you excited by the bombardment? Did it scare you?
We were very young. We were not really aware of the danger, so to speak, at that time.
He's saying this is where they stayed. This is the entrance. What?
But when the Allied airborne assault on the occupying forces manning the artillery battery began, the danger became clear.
Well, we were quite scared because we had never seen anything like that. Plus, the sky was all lit up, just as if it were broad daylight. We were very much surprised, but everyone was delighted, ready to offer Calvados brandy to the first paratroopers to welcome our liberators.
That the Germans abandoned such a valuable asset so early in the invasion was far from the norm. In fact, it would turn out to be the very rare exception. The 3rd Battalion was to work in support of Chapuis' men and then move on to another important objective, securing the amphibious landing forces route off the beach and across the flooded salt marshes. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole was the bold leader charged with that two-pronged task.
Cole was a hard-driving commander, but he was a fair commander, and he always looked out for his men.
I respected Cole for what he was. He expected 100+ out of you.
I think most of his men came to really admire him in combat because he proved to be utterly fearless to the point of being reckless.
With the battery out of commission, around dawn, Cole led his men east to the exit roads off Utah Beach.
Our secondary objective was crossroads to prevent the Germans from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach, and also to take care of any of the Germans retreating from Utah Beach.
At daybreak, Cole has a mixture of 3rd Battalion men, mostly I Company guys, and they are in position right behind the concrete bunkers there. Lou Merlano from A Company set up a roadblock on exit 4.
We had gotten a farmer who killed his cows and built a big roadblock up ahead.
What looked horrible, though, is seeing all these beautiful cattle and horses all dead. Those farmers took a beating on that invasion.
I did give the farmer an IOU, signed FDR that he could turn in when the troops got there.
The first Allied landing ships hit Utah Beach at 6 a.m. Within hours, the amphibious infantry was gaining ground, overcoming the defensive bunkers and pillboxes that elements of the German 709th and 91st Infantry Divisions were using to defend the beachhead. At 9:30, Cole and his men were perfectly positioned when the Germans began retreating.
A lot of them just came out of those impregnable fortifications and started running to the south.
And we came under fire. And I looked back down the road, and Colonel Cole, he's walking up the middle of the road with his 45 in his hand.
And from then on, the war started.
Well, they were firing at us. You know, after you shot at the first time, it's you become a veteran right quick. You don't think anything about the fact that they're humans like we are, and if they're shooting at you, I didn't give it a second thought.
In total, Cole and his men killed about 75 Germans coming off the beach that day. They secured the exit roads, and not a single American was even so much as wounded.
About 4 o'clock that afternoon, the first troops of 4th Infantry Division came over the beach.
The amount of good that did for the seaborne landings is just incalculable. I mean, a few guys with machine guns in those emplacements could have killed hundreds of troops that were debarking on the beach there.
Cole's ambush of the retreating German forces was one of the great early success stories of the invasion. But elsewhere, other battles raged on. That morning, as the beach exits were being cleared, other elements of the 502nd were bleeding hard to achieve their objectives. Cole and his men were busy cutting off the retreating Germans. Lieutenant Colonel Cassidy of the 1st Battalion had his own problems, the first of which were these farmhouses behind me. Known to the airborne as Objective XYZ, the assault that took place here would prove to be one of the most memorable in the entire war.
Amid the chaos of the night drop, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy had still managed to land near his drop zone. By morning, he had set up a command post. Such mission focus was essential and typical of the 1st Battalion commander.
Our battalion commander was Colonel Cassidy, Colonel Patrick Cassidy. He was a great man.
Kind of a happy-go-lucky officer, but he could be tough, too.
But we had a lot of confidence in him, you see.
Down, not far from here. They might last 2 hours. They might last 2 minutes.
Cassidy's clear thinking was crucial because in the early hours of D-Day, commanding officers had a hard time getting information.
Primary means of communication in the airborne was radio. The problem was that many of these radios were either lost, damaged, or totally inoperable after the jump.
Almost to the man, everyone lost their radio. It weighed about 50 pounds in the bag. Well, the planes were going so fast that it ripped right out of your hands.
Without radios, commanders would often resort to using runners.
What this meant was that reports were slow, mostly inaccurate, and hardly timely.
With the coastal artillery battery clear, Cassidy's concern was now the several hundred Germans who operated those guns.
The soldiers were all stationed in a series of houses that became known as the XYZ complex. So the orders went out, clear them out.
Harrison Summers, who happened to be a platoon sergeant in B Company, was around Objective W, where Cassidy's CP was, and he was told to take some men and start clearing the Germans out of those houses.
Summers found a group of soldiers that he really didn't know. They weren't his squad, and tried to get them to follow him. And most of these guys were tired and unsure of who was in charge and decided they weren't going. So Summers and one other soldier, PFC Camion, moved out alone to clear out the XYZ complex, not knowing how many Germans were there.
Summers kicked the door on Building 1, killed a couple Germans in there. Then he went to buildings 2, 3, and 4, which are on the other side of the road, clustered close together, and cleared those buildings.
He went into each of these buildings, and the Germans were just, they weren't even expecting anything to happen, and he'd go in there and spray them with their Tommy gun.
Private John Camion, along with another trooper from the 506, had been attacking other houses in the complex in a similar fashion. When the 506 trooper went down, Camion met up with Summers outside Building 5. They burst in on a group of German soldiers completely oblivious to what was going on outside.
He went into one of those that was a mess hall, and they were sitting there chowing down.
They burst into this farmhouse, and the German soldiers are sitting at the breakfast table. It's an unbelievable story. All this fighting had occurred, and they weren't even taking action. They were sitting down to eat.
When Summers and his squad reached the final building, a bazooka team came forward and lit up the adjoining barn.
Loaded! Wires connected! Go!
Escaping the flames, an additional 30 Germans stumbled out, only to be cut down by Summers and his men.
A couple of other soldiers show up and help, but basically Summers and Camion end up killing 70 German soldiers.
The story that we heard was, hell, Summers went crazy and cleaned out the whole army.
Summers' incredible leadership that day earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. By 3 p.m., Cassidy got the welcome news that the XYZ barracks had been cleared of the enemy. Little did he know the owner of the house in which he set up his command post was hiding 2 Germans herself. The soldiers were eventually discovered and taken prisoner, but the lesson was clear.
The French weren't supposed to be that friendly toward Americans, period. And we should look out for them because they had a reputation of being collaborationists with the Germans. So we're not to trust them at all.
Of course, they were occupied, but it was peaceful with the Germans. They were kind, polite. There were no SS troops.
The sometimes cordial relationships the Norman French had developed with their German occupiers put them in a difficult position when the invasion began. Genevieve Caimère-Lemesson's home, like many, had been commandeered by German troops.
We were hiding in the back of the house when the paratroopers came down. One of them landed on that tree. He came in the house and started asking Germans.
At that time, there were in fact 3 young German soldiers hiding under her staircase.
This was quite a dilemma. Either we give up the Germans or we said to the Americans that there were none, and they could have thought that we were collaborators. We ended up showing the door, and this was tragic for them.
The paratrooper immediately opened up with his rifle. 1 German died instantly, shot through the head. The other 2 lay badly wounded and bleeding on her floor.
By midday on the 6th of June, the paratroopers had accomplished almost all of their missions. They had been able to secure the exits. They'd been able to knock out a lot of the enemy artillery.
Hit on all sides by these small bands of fierce warriors, the Germans were having a tough time trying to determine exactly what was going on.
We had people all over that peninsula, and the Germans couldn't concentrate in any one place. And I think that was a saving grace in reality.
Rommel, who was charged with making sure that all the beach defenses were set and defeating the enemy at the water's edge, wasn't even in Normandy during the invasion. He was back in Germany because his wife's birthday was the 6th of June.
The Germans, they didn't know where to send their men. They were just waiting to see where they're going to gather. But these guys are going off and doing these little jobs on these German positions.
When push came to shove, the German soldiers hunkered down and waited for orders. The paratroopers, they didn't wait for orders. They executed whether there was an officer there or not.
Certainly the German confusion was aiding the Allies. But as Cassidy turned his attention to the regiment's 4th and final objective, he had no idea how beneficial this confusion would turn out to be. The village of Foucarville is an ancient Norman village and no stranger to occupation. Over the centuries, it's seen Roman garrisons, Viking hordes, and English raiders. But in June 1944, it It was the home of the German army.
The village of Fouquerville was designated as the farthest north part in the airborne bridgehead for the 101st.
One of the critical missions of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was to secure this village and to block any German counterattacks from the north.
In addition to clearing out the XYZ barracks, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy's 1st Battalion had been given the crucial task of securing this coastal hamlet 3 miles inland from Utah Beach.
The troops that landed there were supposed to set up roadblocks and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast there.
In the early hours of June 6th, Colonel Cassidy was stationed at his command post when he received word that 40 men stood ready to invade Fouquerville. The man leading the attack would be a lieutenant from A Company, Wallace Swanson.
We didn't have a full complement of guys, but what we had, Swanson took over.
By mid-morning, additional elements of the 502nd were gathering around Fouquerville. Almost immediately, they began setting up roadblocks here and elsewhere in the village, some consisting of only 3 riflemen and a rifle grenadier to cover the road. The force they were facing, about 150 Germans with artillery, and they held the high ground.
When daylight come, everybody came out of the woodwork. And we just set up roadblocks around the place and took up defensive positions.
The German opposition in Fouquerville consisted of German infantry, primarily from the 91st Air Landing Division. The Germans had pre-prepared with machine guns and barbed wire entanglements and emplacements. And there's a German sniper was in the church, and he was very effective in pinning down the Americans from that church tower.
Under orders from Cassidy, Swanson and his ad hoc unit gathered to attack the well-fortified town. Unbeknownst to Swanson, his group was not the first to attempt the Fouquerville objective. Earlier that morning at 2 a.m., Captain Cleveland Fitzgerald and Lieutenant Harold Hogarth of the 1st Battalion had tried to take the village. After stumbling into a German nest, Fitzgerald was shot in the chest, and Hogarth was forced to retreat and wait for reinforcements.
When Swanson first arrived with his men, he didn't know Hogarth, and the soldiers that Hogarth had were there.
We came across Captain Fitzgerald of B Company. He'd been wounded and laying alongside the road.
Fitzgerald was shot through the chest there, a couple inches above the heart. Thought he was going to die.
He was wounded bad. He was shot in the lung. Couldn't hardly breathe.
At 10:30 a.m., as medics attended to the injured Fitzgerald, Swanson led another attack on the village.
It was house-to-house fighting that was the most intense combat that the 101st had fought so far.
The bullets are flying around you, and you're thinking about trying to stop them, you see. At least that's what I was thinking about. Shoot at them to try to stop them, to keep them from shooting at you. And that's what we did.
Fighting continued in Fouquerville throughout the day. Around 3 p.m., the Germans counterattacked and tried to outflank the American position. But the 502nd paratroopers held firm and repulsed the attack.
My platoon sergeant and I heard sniper fire in the church there. So we went inside the church. We started firing up to the belfry ceiling. We must have got the guy. We didn't hear any more firing.
The men at the Fouquerville roadblocks were also successful stopping reinforcements coming to Utah Beach, as well as cutting off Germans fleeing the amphibious invasion. However, German 88mm guns strategically positioned in Fouquerville provided a devastating response.
You could pretty well tell the scream of an 88.
It had a multi-purpose role. It could fire not only as an anti-aircraft weapon, but also as an anti-personnel weapon and an anti-tank weapon.
Back at his command post, Lieutenant Colonel Cassidy grew increasingly alarmed by the mounting casualties he saw coming in from the village. The day-long fight had begun to take a toll on the exhausted and outnumbered paratroopers. Cassidy called for reinforcements in anticipation of a counterattack. But that attack never came, for reasons Cassidy would only find out much later, and due to the efforts of some unlikely heroes. During the previous turbulent night, several paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st had dropped right into German hands near Foucaultville.
"17 American paratroopers had been taken prisoner earlier in the day, and they had been held in a bunker by the German forces.
The guys who were captured there were mostly A Company guys.
From the German perspective, in Foucaultville, the situation was chaotic. American paratroopers had been landing all over the place.
If we thought it was chaos, I'm sure the Germans thought it was chaos.
The Germans didn't know what the rest of the German army was doing. Communications had been cut, their leadership didn't know what was going on, so they were all on their own, and they had to make their own decisions.
The captured paratroopers began to exploit the Germans' confusion. They knew D-Day plans had called for an artillery barrage on the German strongpoint at 10:30 p.m. and were able to use this story to their advantage.
Guys, at 22:30, this whole place is gonna come under bombardment by artillery. We gotta get out of here. It's gonna get blown up to bits.
The Germans understood English, and they got nervous.
So nervous, in fact, that as the hour approached, something remarkable happened. A white flag appeared, and half the Germans surrendered. The rest of the German garrison tried to escape, but in the decisive action of their final D-Day objective, Cassidy's men did not let them get away.
What we were there for was to disrupt the Germans, you see, and cut them off from getting to the beaches where the troops were landed, and that's what we did. So we accomplished our job there.
By 11 p.m. that night, the front was completely quiet. Lieutenant Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, the U.S. Army historian who was assigned to study the airborne operations on D-Day, later wrote that the 1st Battalion of the 502nd was probably the most outstanding battalion of the Normandy operation on D-Day.
Of the 6,670 men dropped near Utah, only about 1/3 had assembled by the end of D-Day. Almost 2,000 were casualties of the days-long battle, and an equal number were simply missing. Still, the mission was a great success, and far less bloody than Eisenhower's marshals had predicted.
I felt we were highly successful because the invasion troops came in on our beaches, Utah Beach, with little or no loss.
There was some hard fighting. There were some people wounded. There were some people killed, but we accomplished the mission.
But the Allies had not fared so well elsewhere. While casualties at Utah Beach numbered around 200, at Omaha that figure was more than 10 times as high. The longest day had come to a close, but the battle was just beginning.
Hitler had given strict orders that the invasion had to be defeated.
He had sent his best troop available to defend until the last man.
Linking Utah and Omaha Beach now became the main objective for the Americans. Failure to do that would jeopardize the entire invasion, a fact that was not lost on the Germans.
The Germans would be seeking the separation between forces, the gaps between units. If they can split the American beachheads, they can change the entire situation in Normandy.
The German High Command knew that failure to push the Allies back into the English Channel meant the war was all but lost. On the other hand, the Allied soldiers knew that this meant a determined German foe, one who would fight tenaciously to the last bullet, to the last man. The struggle to link Utah and Omaha was now on, and in a very real sense, the fate of the Allied invasion depended upon its success.
This program contains graphic animation from the video game Brothers in Arms, hailed by critics for its historically accurate depiction of World War II combat.
It was June 7th, 1944, D-Day +1. The march of the 101st Airborne Division into occupied Normandy had begun.
You're kind of numb. You just put one foot in front of the other because that's what you're trained to do.
There was some hard fighting, but we accomplished the mission.
The Allies had thrown the German army from their beach defenses and were now moving inland. But in the days that followed, the Germans began to punch back.
They opened up on us with machine guns, mortars, artillery, you name it.
They were damn good troops. I mean, they were soldiers, buddy. They were fighters.
That put the fear right into me.
At Utah Beach, it fell to the weary 101st to break the German resistance. Over the next hour, you'll visit the historical locations, hear eyewitness accounts, and learn about America's original paratroopers, brought to life through state-of-the-art graphic animation. These brave men were the tip of the bayonet that drove the German army back to Berlin.
In this show, we'll place you at the tip of that bayonet with the 101st most decorated regiment of the Normandy campaign. They were called the 50 Deuce, and this is their story. As night fell on June 6, 1944, Allied forces continued to pour onto the beaches of Normandy. At some of the beaches, like Omaha, the Allies had experienced a bloody struggle to control it. Here at Utah Beach, however, the landings came off with relative ease. One of the main reasons? The presence of paratroopers like the 502nd.
All the 502nd's D-Day objectives had been accomplished with the help of a disparate group of paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions. The 1st Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy, had established a command post at the farmhouse complex known as the XYZ Barracks, decimating the German garrison with a bold attack and securing the northern flank at Fouquerville. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chappuis's 2nd Battalion had taken control of a German artillery battery in Saint Martin de Varville. And the 3rd Battalion, with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole commanding, had cleared the northernmost exit roads off Utah Beach.
I felt we were highly successful because the invasion troops came in on our beaches, Utah Beach, with little or no loss, a lot of heavy equipment.
That meant what we were supposed to do had been done, and they had very few losses in comparison to Omaha.
The big debate that historians always engage in now is what would have happened if we'd have dropped paratroopers behind Omaha Beach. It certainly would have saved a lot of lives.
Having established control here at Utah Beach and then finally at Omaha, the Allies' main goal now was linking the two beaches, and that meant taking Carentan.
Carentan lay between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. So they put all the paratroopers here because it was very important to take this part, the higher part of the peninsula.
North of the landing beaches was the deep-water port of Cherbourg, a critical objective for the Allies.
You cannot fight a war without logistics, and you have to get all your spare parts and all your equipment and all your ammunition and all your fuel and water and everything else to support that army. You can't do that without a port.
To secure Cherbourg, the 4th Infantry Division, led by Brigadier General Ted Roosevelt, would turn north from Utah Beach. Carentan was to be taken by the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions landing at Omaha Beach, but their casualty rates were too high and their progress too slow. Carentan, therefore, became the sole responsibility of the 101st Airborne.
Now, the Allies recognized that Carentan was the linchpin between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. Now, the Germans realized this as well. So they took one of their best units that was in reserve and launched it in a counterattack against the 101st Airborne with the goal of driving the Americans back into the sea at Utah Beach.
The airborne advance, of course, required supplies and reinforcements, and without an established supply line to the front, that was the primary duty of another element of the 101st.
The 101st Airborne Division had a glider regiment.
Glider troops were very important for the operation.
The idea was that if you came in with gliders, silently, you could land a lot of forces fast. You could land a squad at a time in each glider.
If you can have support of those heavier weapons, you are a much more accurate combat outfit.
But the Germans had prepared simple but devastating defenses.
They'd created a whole series of obstacles that were designed to stop glider landings. What Rommel's men called Rommel's asparagus. These were poles that were dug into the ground, dropped 4 or 5 feet of it into the ground, and had about 6 feet sticking up. And if a glider came in and hit one of those poles, it would rip the wings off or it would crash right into it and kill everybody inside.
Every glider that I had seen was, crushed.
But enough gliders landed. So those were critical to supporting the airborne during the invasion.
By the end of the first day, we were pretty well grouped together. You would ask, do you know where such and such a company's at? And they'd say, yes, down the road here. And so that's the way you would go to find your company.
We had taken a hell of a beating. By that time, we were down to, I'd say, probably 30, 40 men a company.
On D-Day +1, Chapuis and the 2nd Battalion were left in reserve in order to guard the northern flank. The men under the command of Cole and Cassidy were ordered to advance to the south and west.
The paratroopers were now fighting hamlet to hamlet, taking out German positions along the way to Carentan.
And most of the Germans in front of them were retreating south along that road, so they were just chasing them down there, basically.
So you see this same series of sequence happening over and over again, finding the enemy, flanking him, and then trying to finish him. And they moved on toward Carentan in that fashion.
We didn't have any resistance until we got into the little village of Oosville.
Oosville was the 502nd's first major battle on D-Day +1. Lieutenant Colonel Cole's 3rd Battalion led the assault.
Cole just, like the thinker, took his steel pot off, put it on the ground, and sat on it, and he just was contemplating a tactical situation there, and Earl Kelly from I Company was in a hole nearby. He said, "Colonel, sir, please put your helmet on and get in the hole and take cover." And Cole stood up and put his helmet on. He said, "You get in the hole, dumb John. I might need you later."
At some point, I went into a barn, and a German had been wounded, and he came into the barn, and he sat down against the wall and put his feet up like this and leaned over like that, and he died. And I don't know why I felt strange about it. It felt different than seeing them out there, where they'd lay in the foxholes or on the open ground. I don't know why, because it didn't make any difference how you died. But just seeing him sitting there like that, it was, I can still see him, after all these years.
By June 7th and 8th, the 2nd and 3rd day of the invasion, a lot of the guys I talked to they can't tell you anything that happened those days, because by then they were running on nerves. They were literally sleepwalking.
I can't even remember going to sleep that entire time. Strange, ain't it?
General Taylor had told the paratroopers in England that he asked for 3 days of hard fighting and then they'd be relieved.
And I guess we interpret that after 3 days, we're going home.
We didn't have much food either, you see. No water either. And so we were getting pretty exhausted.
Of course, you're still thinking about a lot of the guys that got killed. And you're thinking about who's going to be next.
You were kind of numb. You just put one foot in front of the other because that's what you're trained to do.
On D-Day, the 502nd had a surprising amount of success. In some instances, more than they even had a right to hope for. But as they pushed down the road towards Carentan, their luck was about to take a turn for the worse.
Saint-Côme-du-Mont lies 3 miles north of Carentan along the N13 highway. Its capture had been one of the main D-Day objectives of the 502nd's brother battalions, the 501st and the 506th. But the Germans in the area were tenacious in their defense.
Many would fight to the death, and they were the German paratroopers. And they gave no quarters. I mean, they fought right to the bitter end.
These Fallschirmjägers were determined to slow the paratroopers' advance any way they could.
They were damn good troops. I mean, they were soldiers, buddy. They were fighters.
The 506th and 501st would spend 3 days in the fields and roads around Saint-Côme-du-Mont, trying to dislodge the formidable German defenses in the area.
You're fighting where you had to fight, you know, and if we cornered some Germans over here, hell, we were fighting them there. And if they were trying to break through going someplace else, we were fighting them there. And that's what all the units were doing everywhere.
That battle must have been pretty hardy, because to this day, that's the only battles that I cannot remember all of it. I can remember every other battle almost in detail, but there's parts of this that just blanked out.
Casualties among paratroopers on both sides were high, but they weren't the only victims of those bloody first days.
Soldiers fighting each other, that's one thing. But when you see dead children, dead women, it's tough. Tough. Don't know how they were shot or killed, or from the strafing or the ground fire or naval fire. Who knows? I don't know, but it hurts when you see the loads.
One of the factors that slowed down the 101st considerably during the first days of fighting was an unexpected difficulty unique to the farm country of Normandy: the tall hedgerows lining the farmers' fields.
Those hedgerows, they were terrible. I mean, you just couldn't get through them hedgerows.
Known as the bocage, these hedgerows were really just 4-foot-high mounds of packed dirt used to delineate the checkerboard plots of farmers.
And then they had trees at the top of them. So this isn't your European or English shrubbery. This is a tough mound of dirt that you can't charge through.
We were never told about the hedgerows, never trained for hedgerows in Normandy.
Aerial reconnaissance photos clearly revealed the boxes of the bocage to the Allies, but they underestimated their height, assuming they were more like the low-lying English hedges.
We've never experienced anything like this. So if you could look at it like a block, you fought around the block. You didn't go anywhere. You just kept going around the block.
The Germans had their little foxholes right in the hedgerows, and they had living quarters in there with little shelves for their shaving utensils and their cooking stuff. They had the fields ringed pretty well.
When you got over this hedgerow and dropped on the other side, you're in a box of 4 more hedgerows, and another one forever.
Field by field, the paratroopers battled their German counterparts around the area of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. But just south of the town, where the highway to Carentan formed a V with the road from Utah Beach, elements of the 101st got bogged down in fierce fighting.
About that time, these German paratroopers had made a circle around and came back, and they stuck these smizers through the hedgerows, and they were firing on us within 6 to 8 feet. And we held them off there, and then that's when the tank came in. And I expect to see a big Panther, at least, coming through there. And all of a sudden, this little thing waddles out. It turned out to be a little Stuart. It's kind of disappointing when he's on your side.
The Stuart tank was the first armor to catch up with the 101st Airborne advance.
It was a very fast-moving tank, but it had a very small gun, a 37-millimeter gun, and it had effective machine guns. So it was not an effective tank against German tanks, but it was a pretty good vehicle to have on your side if you're infantry and the enemy doesn't have any tanks.
These Stuart tanks helped win the battle at the junction south of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. But the victory was not without loss.
So this little Stuart tank came up, and he was driving up and down this hedgerow, shooting on the German side, and then he ran out of ammunition, and he said, I have to go back to Normandy Beach to get more ammunition, and he took off. And then I heard the explosion.
The German Panzerfaust unit was able to fire their anti-tank weapon and destroy that tank and kill it right at the corner there.
The tank commander, his body stayed in the turret, sitting up right for about 3 days.
On the road to Carentan, more than 5,000 Allied troops would march past this grisly sight. Years later, that indelible image would remain seared in their memories, a macabre totem of the Normandy fighting experience.
You know, kind of charred, kind of grisly looking sight, but by that time we knew what we were in for.
On June 8th, the town of Saint-Côme-du-Mont was finally taken. The 502nd remained in Hoosville, just to the north, guarding against any German counterattack. William Hebert was 17 years old when the Americans arrived.
I lived here with my parents in this house, and we saw the events looking out the window as much as possible.
For those like Monsieur Hebert, the first days of the invasion were filled with hope and doubt, joy and fear.
We wondered whether the Germans would be able to hold and throw the Americans back into the sea. We did not realize how big the invasion was. We were liberated on the 8th in the morning. They were still fighting, you see. And so, would the Americans be able to hold out? We did not know, and that's why we were apprehensive.
The Germans continued to withdraw, knowing that they couldn't defend against these paratroopers who seemed to be everywhere. As they began to fall back toward Carentan, reinforcements were being sent up from the inland.
The 506th and 501st regiments were in no shape to push forward.
Their forces were still scattered. Most of the units were less than 50%. Casualties had been heavy. Many men were unaccounted for. The confusion and chaos of the first day's fighting had taken its toll.
But Carentan had to be secured. At around 9 p.m. on the night of June 9th, General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st Airborne handed the job to the men of the 50 Deuce.
I think the 502 drew that assignment from Taylor because they were the premier unit in the 101st. But on the other hand, it was soon learned that using them in a role like this was extremely costly.
But just how costly, no one could have ever expected.
Since the jump on D-Day, the regiment had fought mostly in the French countryside. Now they had to attack down one long, narrow road, covered by murderous German fire.
Saint-Côme-du-Mont controls the road that leads to Carentan. The rest of this area is all flooded, so from Saint-Côme-du-Mont to Carentan, there's really only one route, and that's down this narrow causeway.
While the other regiments of the 101st were to surround Carentan, the objective of the 502nd was to spearhead the assault on the city and take the fight to the heart of the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's 3rd Battalion was to lead the charge down the causeway toward Carentan.
They don't have air support, they don't have armor support, they're just going to have to make do.
We didn't know what the German resistance was going to be. On the approach to Carentan, we had probably a mile and a half of road there that was straight down, and there were 4 bridges.
The right-hand side of the road was under protective fire, mortars, machine guns, rifle. The left side of the road was underwater.
It was very tough for them to capture each bridge because they just simply couldn't take cover.
You didn't do much standing up going down that road. You sort of went in a crouch position a lot to try to keep from being such an orange target.
We know in retrospect, and that problem could have been eliminated so easily by a little air support. But it was the urgency to take Carentan. They didn't have time. They just sent these guys down there.
The 3rd Battalion's initial movements past the causeway's first bridge met with little resistance. However, the 2nd bridge, which had been destroyed by retreating German forces, would prove far more difficult.
They had to improvise a footbridge to get across. You basically cross this thing one man at a time. On top of that, you're being fired at by Germans in Carentan, by Germans on your flanks who are in boats.
You drop down into the temporary footbridge and then cross on over, hoping that you'd catch it when they were not firing, because they seemed to be firing right at the bridge.
The snipers and whatnot had it well covered. Everybody had to go across that, shimmy across that flank, and they were plunking them off right fast, didn't they, about every other man. The man ahead of me got knocked off. I got over, and the man behind me got knocked off. So finally, I decided I've had enough of this, so I opened up on the area I thought he was in. So he never fired any more, as far as I know.
As the men tried to cross that makeshift bridge single file, they were also trying not to bunch up, as an 88mm gun situated in Carentan was taking pot shots at them whenever they got too close together.
Nothing could be much worse than an 88. Those Germans knew how to use them.
It's a natural tendency for soldiers, when you're scared and being shot at, to get together and bunch together. When you bunch together, that gives the enemy a target. Cole kept telling the men to spread out.
Cole was all over the causeway during that long day, and as a result, his standing with the soldiers who followed him only grew. All day, he moved up and down the road, exhorting his men, recklessly disregarding the German fire.
Chester Elliott from my company described being in a ditch with a couple other fellas and bullets just spraying across the surface of the road there on the causeway, and Cole walking up with a .45 pistol in his hand. And he stood above these guys, said, "What's wrong, fellas?" And they said, "We're pinned down, sir." He said, "Come on, let's go get that son of a bitch," you know, and he just wouldn't take cover. It's just a miracle that he wasn't killed. It's nothing less than miraculous. And he was certainly an inspiration to his troops by doing that.
The 3rd Battalion finally made its way down the causeway and was spread in a long line from bridge number 2 at the Douve River all the way up to the final bridge, number 4, on the Madeline River.
From that bridge into Carentan, that was when the German defenses really stiffened.
On bridge number 4, there was what the German call a Belgian gate.
Now what this is an obstacle that is actually taken from fencing in Belgium that the Germans used that just blocked the causeway. And they had to, the paratroopers had to squeeze through this Belgian gate one at a time to get to the other side.
A lot of guys got hit there.
There were lots of people laying off to the side of the road wounded. There was lots of people laying off to the side of the road that was killed.
Throughout the day, the 3rd Battalion suffered many casualties to German sniper and artillery fire. But the most devastating blow would come at dusk. Suddenly, a low hum could be heard in the distance, and just over the horizon, the vague outline of an object the paratroopers had not seen before was beginning to take shape. It was a German dive bomber.
It came along, and it wasn't flying very high, and it wasn't flying very fast. And it just strafed the area around where we was at.
There is some dispute as to the number of planes that opened up on the 502nd. Some say 3, others swear there was only a pair. Regardless, the assault was deadly.
There were small anti-personnel bombs.
You could hear these bombs whistling and, of course, the explosion.
And, of course, there was people running and dodging and trying to get cover and everything.
You wanted to dig in when you couldn't dig in.
Men started hollering because they were hit.
One of the men in our company was killed simply by concussion.
Because the Allies had established air superiority previous to the invasion, the sight of the once vaunted German Luftwaffe was a rarity. Indeed, the dive bombers were gone almost as suddenly as they appeared. But during the night, as Cole moved up and down his lines, the cumulative effect of the day was clear.
There were many casualties in that battalion that day as they crossed the causeway.
It seemed that we were not able to move, and we couldn't because of the firing I guess we all realized it was not going as it had been planned, as quick as it was.
Cole knew that another day of similar advancement would leave his battalion decimated, but he also knew he couldn't very well stay where he was.
Cole's dilemma, as the sun rose, was that the enemy were in the farmhouse a good run away from his position. He couldn't go back, he couldn't stay where he was, and he had to cross open ground. There were really no ditches to run into, there were no rocks to hide behind. He had open ground between him and the enemy.
It's clear from the accounts of the day that Cole knew his situation was dire. He had to get his men past the final bridge and into a defensive position or watch as they were slowly annihilated. With the dawn beginning to break, Cole strode to the front of his battered regiment. He'd made a decision. It was now or never. Strung out between the 4 bridges that led into Carentan, Cole's men were taking a brutal beating. They were either caught in the open or had minimal cover. So with the sun rising, Cole sent the word to his men, fix bayonets. He was going to take this farmhouse or die trying.
We had been stalemated there, and we still had not gotten too much past the 4th bridge.
Cole had the dilemma there. He either had to move his people back up the causeway or just lay there all morning and get sniped at or make a decisive move.
So he told us, he said, man, we can't stay here. If we stay here, they're gonna kill every one of us. He says, I'm gonna give you 10 minutes to smoke a cigarette. For some of you, it'll be the last cigarette. And when that 10 minutes is up, I'm gonna blow my whistle.
Well, he said, fix bayonets and charge.
That put the fear right into me, and plus probably a little bit of bad stuff in my pants, too. It scared me, really.
At around 6 a.m., Cole ordered a smoke and artillery barrage. Then, the whistle blew.
Over that hedgerow he went. He meant what he said.
Most of them didn't hear the whistle, so the charge got off to a rather ragged start.
It was a very confused situation. We were stretched out down a road a mile this way, so communication was a problem.
The initial figure may have been as low as 25 guys that jumped up and ran with Cole.
People firing at you and you got no cover. You'd be stupid to stand up and run.
The fire was murderous, but Cole was out there waving him on, just firing wildly in the direction of the enemy with his .45. And he said, damn, I don't know what I'm shooting at, but I got to keep going. His men were laughing, even though it was dangerous.
See, that's what I liked about him, and the men did too. They liked to follow a good man, and he was a good man.
Inspired by his example, the bulk of Cole's men followed shortly thereafter.
We went over that hedge, that's when it all broke loose.
Sergeant Specter was the first sergeant in H Company. He was the first man to reach the objective, the farmhouse. He shot the lock off the door, and Cole went in and made that his new command post. And then other troops proceeded farther beyond into the apple orchard where the fighting continued.
Cole's charge did not break the enemy's back. In fact, it almost broke the 502nd. Battered and exhausted, his remaining men dug into a nearby cabbage patch to defend their hard-fought gains. Another day of grueling fighting lay ahead.
So they opened up on us with machine guns, mortars, artillery, you name it.
Somehow, however, I got over into the cabbage patch. How we got over there, I don't have the faintest idea.
Both Germans and Americans fought relentlessly, and the fighting was the fiercest the 502nd had yet encountered.
Somebody yelled, don't waste bullets, stick them.
And those Germans that stayed in those positions, the paratroopers bayoneted.
Lieutenant Provost, this little lieutenant that was 5'4", he stuck a few of them with his bayonet, and Sterno saw him coming back out of the orchard a few minutes later, and Provost was saying, they squeal when you stick them.
That bayonet attack, I'll never forget that. That was the worst of all. Lost a lot of people. Wounded a lot of people.
Finally, at about 3 p.m., there came a lull in the fighting and a truce was called. Both sides used the opportunity to collect their dead and wounded. And as medics made their way around the field of battle, the full scale of the day's carnage became evident. I Company, in particular, had been hit hard.
When we all got together, and 120-some-odd men went in there, there was only 13 of us left, and I was one of the 13. And that was very scary then, to realize that we'd been shot up like that.
We'd lost so many people that I guess Cole had asked for help.
In response, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy's 1st Battalion fought their way forward to reinforce the decimated 3rd Battalion.
They were trying to move forward beyond Cole to follow the enemy through, but they were so shot up on their way, moving down the causeway, that by the time the 1st Battalion arrived to reinforce the 3rd Battalion, Cole's battalion, they were not a combat effective force that could continue the attack. So Cole and Cassidy decided they would defend there at the farmhouse in the hedgerows, and they did that. It was the right decision because several German counterattacks occurred and they repulsed those attacks.
They're coming back!
But finally, as night fell, the exhausted Fallschirmjägers withdrew the bulk of their force to a position outside of Carentan, leaving only a handful of soldiers to defend the city proper. Compared with the fighting on the road to Carentan, the capture of the actual city was swift.
The 327th went around the north of Carentan, 501 to the left and 502 through the center, and the 506, including E Company, liberated Carentan. It was a full, successful, divisional coordinated attack.
On June 12th, Carentan finally fell to the Allies, but the price for that victory was steep. Purple Heart Lane had exacted a fearsome toll on the 502nd.
The whole battalion was less than 200 men out of 680 when they pulled them back.
We lost a lot of people, but we took Carrington.
If it hadn't been for the 502, they never would have took Carrington.
Matter of fact, the 502 won the first presidential citation.
For his part in the Battle of Purple Heart Lane, Lieutenant Colonel Cole was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. In the entire war in Europe, only one other soldier of the 101st would receive that honor.
At 6:15, the majority of the battalion took off across this field here and charged right up in this direction here over those emplacements and crossed in through there, with the initial objective being the orchard the other side of the house here.
Colonel Cole was an ideal man. You wanted him to be your friend, you his friend.
He was wonderful. He'd give the men incentive.
He was a different caliber.
I saw that the only solution was either to withdraw back the bridge and run the chance of getting everybody killed withdrawing, to attack this position, or just lie in the ditches and be sniped to death.
He got out there in front of his men and led his men. He didn't send his men, you see. So it showed you that he was a leader and he was a hero, you see.
As combined elements of the 101st moved in to occupy the city, the French locals who'd been subjected to days of fighting finally came out of hiding to see their liberators. Edouard Pimond was 20 years old when the American paratroopers liberated the city of Carentan.
Here in this alley, we were in this cellar. We were at least 5 or 6 families. And a soldier leaned down and yelled right here, "Are there any Germans in there?" And people were down there waiting.
Were you afraid?
Sure we were afraid, because all through this time we heard shooting, we heard shelling, and so everyone in there, people were praying all day long.
Like many of the citizens, Pimond warmly welcomed the Americans, but not without some hesitation.
How did the town react to the arrival of the soldiers?
Everyone put out their little French flags or their little American flags. We all put them out the window happily. But then, the next morning, we heard from the mayor's office that we needed to take it all down because the Germans were coming back.
In fact, the Germans were returning. The Fallschirmjägers had regrouped with an armored division, the 17th Panzer Grenadiers, part of the fanatical SS, who were driving towards Carentan to mount a counterattack.
They counterattack from the southwest, aiming to not only retake Carentan, but to drive all the way to the channel and to push the invasion back into the sea.
As the 17th Panzer Grenadiers made their way toward Carentan, the devastated 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 502nd made their way toward the rear. In their stead, the 2nd Battalion was rushed forward. The German counterattack was coming, and it would take everything the airborne forces had just to hold on. As morning broke on the 13th, the crack 17th Panzer Grenadiers were just a few miles from here. It fell once again to the American paratroopers to thwart their counterattack and hold the line.
These soldiers were tired. They had done everything that was humanly possible. They had done what was required of them, but they still had yet to fight.
Hitler's elite 17th SS Panzer Grenadiers were tough, experienced tankers and infantrymen, accustomed to working as a combat team. They linked up with the remnants of the 6th Parachute Regiment, who had fought so tenaciously outside Carentan. The two forces planned to retake the city with a massive counterattack.
If they succeeded, the Allied invasion beaches would be separated, and the opportunity for the Germans to drive forward to Utah Beach and crush the invasion put the entire Allied effort in jeopardy.
The 502nd had been all but decimated during their heroic actions on the causeway leading into Carentan. So the 506th and 501st took up defensive positions south of the city, their left flank reinforced by glider troops of the 327th. Their orders? Hold the Germans off until American tanks of the 2nd Armored Division could arrive from Omaha Beach.
Airborne tactics, there's no such thing as retreat. Whichever way you go, you're going to retreat to the front until somebody comes up and helps you.
Before dawn on June 13th, the attack came.
They got tanks!
The attack of the 17th Waffen-SS smashed into the 101st lines. There was fierce fighting.
They made a full-scale attack. In fact, they had tanks with them. They had Panther tanks. And they came down there with a fury.
It was bad. It was bad fighting. It was tough going, and you kept losing so many men.
The men of the 506th would take the brunt of the ferocious German counterattack in an area later to be known as Bloody Gulch.
We need armor now!
They moved us right down in Bloody Gulch. It was nothing but a big groove with a hedgerow on one side, you know, pretty high. In other words, they're up there about 6 to 8 feet.
The 506 had to hold them off that day for a number of hours, actually from dawn until about 1 or 2 in the afternoon with just small weapons.
My sergeant said, when you see any Germans coming down that street, you take care of them. And I could hear these tanks coming. What the hell am I going to do with my carbine?
The Waffen-SS are determined to break through and take Carentan. The 101st are determined to hold. It's a fierce fight. The 101st is not winning this fight, but they're not giving up either.
The 506 was pushed back almost to the city itself, its right flank in danger of collapsing. It was time for the 2nd Battalion of the 50 Deuce to enter the fray. Back near Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the battalion had been motorized, put onto transport vehicles that had landed at Utah, and by 10 a.m., they arrived on the front lines.
The men of the 502nd, no matter how tired they were, had to pick up their gear, pick up their rifles, move forward and fight again. And they did.
Even some of the battle-weary men of Cole's 3rd Battalion were brought into the fray.
We got a report that they had broken through, and we jumped up and double-timed about 1.5 miles because we were to be the infantry to back them up.
With virtually the entire 101st Division committed to battle, paratroopers kept the Germans out of Carentan. Barely.
We went in with bayonets. We slid down, we threw grenades and slid down, and then we were amongst them, as I always put it. Saw one guy get blowed off at the hips. The top disappeared, and just 2 legs fell on the ground. And I seen a guy with his jaws, suddenly his jaw's gone.
Keep shooting! No one breaks through!
Finally, the 2nd Armored Division from Omaha Beach arrived, and they weren't called the Hell on Wheels Division for nothing.
In the nick of time, the 2nd Armored Division arrives, almost like the cavalry in an old Western movie.
First tank comes in there, and myself and several others just rush out and plant a big kiss on the tank, and of course we shake hands and hug the guys, the crew. We were really appreciative of those guys.
I kissed that tanker, I'll tell you. Yeah, glad to see him because we had been getting chased around pretty bad.
The Hell on Wheels tank division descended on their German adversaries with a fury, and by the evening of the 13th, the men of the 502nd were leading their own counterattack, this time with armored support.
This broke the back of the German attack. The 2nd Armored Division was able to move forward, and the 2nd Armored and the 101st pushed the Germans back.
And they inflicted so many casualties in the first 2 days of contact with them there that they never mounted a significant counterattack in that sector again.
At last, 8 full days since paratroopers first landed, the liberation of Carentan was complete. The threat of German counterattack neutralized.
If they'd been able to slice through the rather lightly equipped 101st Airborne Division, there wouldn't have been much at the beachhead to stop them.
Utah and Omaha were now secure, and the full-scale liberation of Europe was underway.
People were coming ashore. They'd gotten Omaha straightened out, and the beachhead was linked up.
The 101st Airborne had proven beyond all doubt the effectiveness of their elite units. The cost, however, had been high. Of the 6,670 men who jumped into Normandy with the division, only 2,000 escaped unharmed. It would take 11 more months of hard fighting before Nazi Germany's final surrender. But on July 7th, just before their return to England, General Maxwell Taylor of the 101st Airborne addressed his men from atop a pillbox near Cherbourg. You hit the ground running toward the enemy. You proved the German soldier is no Superman. You've beaten him on his own ground, and you can beat him on any ground.
It's been said that the Second World War was the singular event of human history, all the world engaged in one titanic struggle. But the war was not won by larger-than-life politicians or generals pushing pieces across a map, but rather through the small, remarkable acts of courage, such as those performed by the men of the 50 Deuce, ordinary men performing the truly extraordinary.
I was glad to be a part of it because of what the Germans were doing. What they were doing was wrong, and it had to be righted, and I was glad to be a part of that righted the wrong.
Had to be done. It really had no choice. You know, it was something that had to be done. The man had to be stopped. The country, the world couldn't go on the way it was.
When you go through things in war, where you face fear together, and you have to conquer fear. You maybe have to, you know, hold one of your comrades in your arms when he's dying. This changes you, and it lasts a lifetime.
We done this, not I. We done it. And the guys that won the war, in my book, is the guy that didn't come back.
I'm a lucky survivor. That's what I always feel about it. The heroes are still over there with white crosses over them. We should never forget it.
Comes a point of time when you must fight. You must fight, and you got to stand up for your rights, because our country might not be perfect, but it's better than the majority of them. And I would fight for it any time again.